Constraints were consistent with the Internet Society's origin and mission statement and its incorporation documents. The proposals considered by this working group will not include proposals to reduce stakeholder community's ability to choose candidates to serve on the Board of Trustees, or proposals that would require relocation or dissolution of the Internet Society as it is currently incorporated in the United States. In addition, this working group will not consider proposals that would breach or negate current legal relationships and agreements between the Internet Society and ICANN, or between the Internet Society and the Public Interest Registry. So those were constraints on the work of the governance working group, governance reform working group, and our constraints on today's discussion as well. Next slide. That brings us to the balance of time, which is for discussion. And at this point, the floor is open, and I look forward to hearing your comments. John?
I know we've been going around with this a lot. I was wondering if we could just review what the nominating committees have been doing in recent years to try and come up with diverse slates of candidates. Because as I keep pointing out, I mean, the way the governance works is the three constituencies can pick whoever they want to pick. And my impression is that each one has its own sort of criteria about how it's going to look for candidates. Sometimes it gets, people from a wider geographical or gender balance, and sometimes it doesn't. But I haven't yet heard anybody come up with a plausible way that we could, without doing some gross violence in the way that the trustees are selected, have any sort of mandatory stuff. So basically the question is I've been on the board for a while. What are non-coms done recently to look for diverse candidates?
Clearly, there are a couple of different nom-coms involved. There's both the nom-com that the board itself runs for PIR, and then there's the nom-com for candidates for the organizational member and chapter member elections. Distinct from that is the selection mechanism done by the IAB, but for the two which are done related to the organizational and chapter members, I wonder if possibly one of the members of this year's committee would like to speak.
This is George. I can speak to that now. I think the most effective way that we have been able to identify a diverse candidate pool is to get people on the non-com who are in themselves make a diverse group. Last year we had, the year before, we had a very active member from Pakistan, and as a result we had a candidate from Pakistan who was actually elected. This year we had a larger diversity in the non-com itself, and this has caused the members of the non-com who are obligated to do recruiting for candidates they believe are worthy of serving on the board are going to go into their regions and their countries and into the people they know, their colleagues in these countries, and we get a better selection in that way. So diversifying the non-com is the way in which it turns out we believe is so far the best way that we've managed to address the diversity issue.
Thanks, George. In addition to that, the non-coms have historically tried to reach out to both the chapters and to the organizational members and to ask them to focus on diversity as they consider who to nominate. So it's clearly the case that some of the diversity can be done by making sure that each of the constituent communities is aware of the desire of both the board and the larger community to have a diverse board. Luis?
Thank you, Ted. Thank you, John, for your question. I can only say that the diversity in the NOMCOM reflects what happens in the chapters. There's nothing more diverse in ISOC than the chapters itself. So I strongly believe that chapters are, as you were referring to constituencies, that chapters are represented in the NOMCOM, and what we are getting as nominations from the chapters represent the diversity of ISOC itself. Thank you.
As the chair of the PIR NOMCOM this year, I will say that my experience reflects George's in terms of how we got diversity into our candidate pool. I think personal outreach and getting the word out is really the key point there. I think at least in the PIR NOMCOM this year, a lot of our candidate sourcing was via direct referrals from folks who were either on the NOMCOM or close to the NOMCOM, or kind of in the circle. So the more people can spread the word about these opportunities and encourage folks in their communities to get involved, I think that's how we can help us sourcing a more diverse candidate pool. Another thing I believe I put in my PIR NOMCOM report this year that I think is interesting to track is kind of diversity through the process, to make sure that the diversity we get from the candidate pools is tracked through as folks go through the process. And I think that's some way we can help hold ourselves accountable on diversity as well.
Thank you, Richard. There's a question from the chat from Gunilla in Australia, part of the Accessibility SG. Has any consideration been done on quotas or similar on gender, disability, and geographic diversity? Has an increase of the number of board members been considered to address diversity? So people have discussed this, and I think as the point John Levine was making earlier is because each different constituency sends different members to the board, the idea of creating a quota has the practical effect of imposing something on three different groups, and those three different groups having to make independent choices which result in fulfilling a quota, which is difficult to do. So mechanically, that's been considered, but it's also been somewhat difficult to reconcile that with the constraints that were placed in the Governance Reform Working Group to ensure that the constituent groups of ISOC retained their ability to send members to the board. And I'll point out here that there is a considerable difference between the way they're elected and the way they must act once they reach the board. Once people are placed on the board, they have a fiduciary responsibility to the Internet Society as a whole, and so they are not there as representatives of the group which sent them. So for example, I was selected by the organizational members, but it is not the case that I represent the organizational members on the board. Like the other members of the board, we all act in concert to serve the society as a whole. And that means that the constituent mechanism for selecting people is intended to make sure that the skills and passions of their community is present on the board, but they are not a representative of their constituency once present. The other point that is being made in chat is that quotas get complicated with multiple appointment pathways, and that ICANN faces a similar issue. The other question you had is, has an increase of the number of board members been considered to address diversity? It has been considered, and the way that current bylaws are written, the board can itself nominate the board can itself select individuals to join the board. A limited number may be selected in this way, and the board has considered using that power to increase its diversity either on gender or geographic lines. The difficulty there is the appointments are standard appointments to the board. They're a 3-year appointment. And the result of that is any effort that the board makes to increase its diversity through this means creates a 3-year appointment that doesn't necessarily reflect the same problems that the board would face in the following years. So if you saw, for example, a geographic diversity problem in year 1, addressed it by making one or more appointments from the board itself to join the board. You then might have different geographic problems in year 2 and 3 of those appointments. So it's a very limited power, and it's one we've not yet actually used, although there was discussion in the board governance committee about it over this past year. If it is used, it's most likely to be used for diversity issues which appear to be quite long-standing, as opposed to those which we believe would be the result of a single year or 2-year composition of the board. There's a comment from Paul Wilson in the chat that the explanation makes it seem like the diversity of the board changes often, but that's not the impression that one gets. I would suggest that a 3-year appointment by the board would still have a better effect on diversity. Thanks for your comment, Paul. Would you like to follow up by voice?
Thanks a lot, Ted. Is it? Yeah, no. Just as I said, if you're concerned that a 3-year appointment by the board might have some adverse effects in the 2nd and 3rd year, that seems to assume that the diversity and the balance changes very often, which, as I said, isn't the impression that one gets. So I'd have thought that even despite the 3-year commitment that a board appointment would entail, that's likely, on the balance, to still have a better effect on diversity than not to make an appointment like that at all. The other thing I might also observe is that although the ICANN and ISOC board appointment processes are very different, my understanding is that one of the duties of the ICANN NomCom appointments is to actually to redress the issues of diversity that arise from the stakeholder groups doing their own thing independently, appointing the directors on the basis of their own criteria, which have got a lot to do with technical and domain expertise, and which can well result in a lack of diversity, and therefore the ICANN NomCom is there specifically to try and address that diversity. At least as I understand it, and I may be wrong, that's one of the duties of the ICANN NomCom, and that's something that possibly the ISOC could try and replicate somehow, without as you suggested before, trying to constrain the actual operation of each of the constituencies in the selection of their best chosen board members.
Thank you for your comments, Paul. And just to clarify one thing, it was not so much that making a single appointment would necessarily have that effect, but if the board exercised its power to the limit of its capacity, which would add 3, gender parity, for example, or to even approach it. The results in the later years might create difficulties with other forms of diversity, the specific geographic diversities or similar issues. So it would also obviously increase the size of the board substantially, which has other effects. There are a couple of comments in chat, and then I'll turn to Cheryl. Just before that, Cheryl, the comments in chat are from Farzana, actually a GNSO council. Have a quota more or less. It's hard but doable. And then Cheryl in chat says it has specific diversity requirements. Yes, full, so it is balancing roles important, but not its only purpose. Cheryl, would you like to continue by voice?
Indeed, I would. Thank you very much, Cheryl, and also for the record. I said it was important to follow on from Paul Wilson's intervention because I've served in leadership of the ICANN nominating committee, and I'm still currently involved in the implementation of its most recent review processes and its recommendations. The balancing role that it picks up after the various component parts have made their appointments to try and manage as best as possible, and it is always limited because you can only appoint from the nominations you get. It does indeed have an important fill-in for various types of diversity. But one of its primary pillars, of course, is to work in areas of diversity that may not be as obvious as gender, accessibility, language use, type of economy that one comes from, but skill sets. And so there are nomination processes which also balance desired skill sets in a board. So I just wanted to throw that in there, that having that slightly different role, noting, of course, that the ICANN nominating committee is in fact an appointing body, not a nominating committee in the manner of the ISOC one.
Thank you. Richard?
Yeah, I just want to thank Cheryl for a couple of points there. Especially the point about skills diversity. It's that's certainly an area we considered in the PIR non-com this year as we try and kind of, much like the ICANN non-com, the PIR non-com we have here is an appointing body, not a nominating body. So we're very clearly thinking about how to put together the right team for the PIR board, including dimensions like skills. With that in mind, I have a couple of questions I would be interested in get people's feedback on. One, from that perspective of skills balance. Clearly, the board, I think, I certainly do, I think others on the board would have an idea of what skills we on the board feel like the board could use, and what would be a consideration in that kind of skill set diversity. Wondering if folks would feel like that would be useful for the sitting board to provide maybe more detailed desiderata kind of advice to the community about what we think would be useful in the next round of appointments. So that's one question. The other question is kind of more generally, I would be interested to know which dimensions of diversity folks are most interested in here, kind of how they think that relates to the work of the Internet Society Board. Cheryl highlighted a few, gender, geographic diversity. We've talked about skill set diversity, accessibility. I'll say in the PR non-com, we focused, the metrics I tracked were primarily geographic and gender diversity. But very interested to hear kind of which aspects of diversity are kind of top of mind for folks in this community.
Thank you, Richard. I'll note that Charles Mock has a very similar question in chat, following on Paul and Ganella's questions and comments. Does the non-com have any assessment on the relative problems we have with gender, disability, geographic, and skill balance? Which is the biggest gap you see? And Cheryl has followed up with gap analysis and desirable skills are certainly useful things to have identified. Are there comments from the floor on this point?
Well, maybe I'll chime in. I'm Charles. I just, actually the reason I asked is that I want to get an understanding on the current assessment from the the NOMCOM on these issues, because as you said, at the moment you decided that to basically haven't done that appointment yet. But what are the real reasons, or the only reason is the one that you have cited, which was that the requirements or the gap may change from year to year. So that makes me wonder, out of the different kinds of possible gaps, what is the NOMCOM or the board's assessment on what is the biggest one, and what is the one that, or one or more than one that might be ongoing, or it isn't just. I tend to think that there are, among the ones that we have mentioned so far, like gender, disability, geographic, skill balance, there seem to be some of these that are quite long-standing. So why is it that the board or the NOMCOM still consider that they basically haven't exercised that option yet? Thank you.
Thank you. And just as a reminder, because the NOMCOM is not an appointing body, it presents candidates to the community and the community selects among them. Yes. And so it has been the case for quite some time that the candidates presented are diverse. And it is not necessarily the case that the candidates which contribute to specific forms of diversity have necessarily been selected. So that two-stage aspect of the process is one of the complications here that makes it difficult. If the board were to set, for example, a hard target of gender parity, which many boards have set, it would then have to work out how it achieved that without changing the right of the different constituents to select board members. So that's one of the complications here. It is the case that gender diversity is a long-standing problem, and it is also the case that geographic diversity is a potential problem depending on how you define it. And that's also been one of the issues that if you define for example, at least one member of each of the following geographies, you get a different question than are the
mamanya suruh naik ke atas.
Aduh, tega banget.
Tega, udah kamu yang naik ke atas deh. Mamanya kan susah buat naik turun deh. Sini dulu lah.
to their activity on the board. So there's more than one way. There are a couple of interventions by chat. Richard Barnes noted, Charles has a second question. What are the reasons for deciding not to make appointments yet? Richard Barnes noted, thank you to Cheryl for the comments which he felt were actionable for the next NOMCOM cycle. John Levine points out that chapters and orgs can also nominate anyone they want by petition, and voters can vote for whoever they want. And Fazana notes that she doesn't generally recommend looking at ICANN as a guide for diversity. They work hard on it, but unfortunately face a problem with new volunteers and new entries. And when new people actually run for positions, they don't get elected. Gap analysis is great, but when we want to stick to the status quo and have the same people elected, then it's hard to have diversity. This happens at our areas as well. They do complain about diversity, but when non-male candidates run, they don't vote. Charles noted that we had answered his second question, and Cheryl points out that the difference between appointments by parts of ICANN versus the ICANN non-party appointments. And Louise notes gender concerns of worth looking at gender balance in industry and in Louise, do you want to raise that question a bit more?
Yes, thank you, Ted. Well, during the last months, we have made some analysis on how the telecommunications industry is balanced in terms of gender, and also in other boards of that may be comparable to ISOC, and things are not balanced. There is no parity. So if we look into membership, that will be reflected into the chapter's ability to provide candidates for the board, then there's I will say it in a very electrical engineering way, there's a mismatch of impedance because there is no parity on the origin, so it's hard to get a parity on the result. Yes, so and there's also many measurements. Even a number of organizations study the diversity within the boards, and we are not in the line, but we are not very far from what you would expect from a charity organization, as happens in North America. Yes, and maybe in Europe. In Europe, there is a lack of studies on the balance regarding diversity in the boards. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Cheryl points out that ICANN NC is specifically designed to bring in, where possible and practical, new people to new positions. And it is something that we do point out to each of the constituents on a periodic basis, constituent groups, that they don't actually have to elect folks who are directly part of their communities. So it's possible, for example, that the ITF could select somebody who has not participated in the ITF if they felt that person was an appropriate board member and the best available candidate. So it's a problem for them to identify such candidates and to solicit their participation in the process. But there is no restriction, for example, that the chapters select somebody who is currently a chapter member, that the organizational members select somebody who's currently part of one of the organizations, or that the ITF select one of its participants. That does give them degrees of freedom there that might help them address the problem that Luis is pointing out.
Hi, it's Charles. It seems to me that has it been considered that maybe an appointment for a shorter period of the term, like instead of 3 years, maybe 1 or 2 years, after the one of the problems with NOMCOM is that you nominate, you might recruit or nominate somebody, but the election result may not reflect, the way that the NOMCOM may try to hope to close a particular gap. But has it been considered that maybe appointment afterwards is a way to help that kind of balance? Thank you.
So that was the general problem that the governance board committee was discussing this year, and that is specifically if the Internet Society Board were to make appointments that were intended to resolve or to improve specific diversity questions, what would that process look like? And functionally, there is a question there. Would it be the board selecting it after an open call? Would it be the board selecting it from within the sets of people that the board itself felt would address the issue, or would it be through some other process? And the governance committee unfortunately made not great progress on that. And I have to say that it's a difficult problem, because if you say that the board itself is going to make the appointment to address a skills diversity issue, that sort of gives you one set of problems. The board itself may be aware of where it lacks, especially after a particular cycle, where it lacks specific capabilities. If it felt like it needed specific financial acumen, for example, very to in its own membership, reaching out to people they do have that specific financial acumen might be the appropriate way to fill that kind of gap. But it might not be the appropriate way to fill other kinds of diversity problems, a gender diversity problem or a geographic diversity problem. And there, a modified open call might be appropriate, but it is a bit tricky, right? I mean, in all of these cases, there's almost certain to be more than one axis of diversity that could be addressed. And so figuring out how you make that call, if you are going to make an open call, is important. And if you're not, there's a real chance you're going to fill the gap with somebody who's already an insider. And that reinforces other ways in which boards can kind of ossify. So it's something that the board discussed in that committee and unfortunately just didn't make enough progress to bring forward a proposal at this time. I see Richard's hand, and then there are some interventions in the chat, which I'll go to. Richard?
Yeah, I was inspired by Charles's point about shorter terms. Just to comment on a different dynamic, a non-diversity dynamic, which is a bit in tension, which is that the board, as it's constituted, in part due to how trustees are appointed, has, I think, an unusually high level of turnover relative to other boards of similar organizations, which can be good in terms of bringing in fresh talent, but is also a challenge in terms of maintaining some level of organizational continuity, institutional knowledge, and things like that, keeping rapport on the board, and building a team, and things like that. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind if we were to consider things like shorter terms, is that would increase that kind of high turnover even further.
It would also require us to update the bylaws, which specify the terms. The interventions in chat, Wilson notes, interested to know, are there accepted/useful means of measuring diversity in an objective way, such that performance can be measured and targets set? Also interested on behalf of APNet. There certainly are different measures that have been used in the past, and those can definitely be applied here. Luis has put a set of references into the chat for you. I will not read those aloud, but for those of you who are listening, they will be in the transcript.
I will add on Paul's measurement point. It does seem like in principle that would be an exercise that one could embark on. If we were to try and do that sort of measurement, it might be interesting to put it in the context of some other measures of diversity in this community. So we say diversity of the chapter population or the organization member population.
Thanks, but I'll point out that in reference to that, the point that Luis made earlier about the lack of diversity in some of the populations is quite concerning there.
Sure.
If you looked at the ITF, the ITF recently ran a survey in its most recent meeting, and among the survey responses were the self-identified gender diversity of the individuals at the meeting, and the gender diversity at that specific meeting was 10% of the community present were women, or identified as women. And obviously that means that the pool of people that they might draw on if they were looking internally would not itself have the diversity that might be a target for the board. Luis?
Yeah, thank you, Ted. Also, if we look into geographical diversity as is a common measure, if we look at the places where ISOC has a presence, speaking specifically about chapters, we have to accept that in the Pacific region, there is no much ISOC presence, as well as in many countries that in Asia. So that makes also this impedance mismatch I was talking about. Yes, there is not enough possibilities for having a real diversity, rather than the places where we have a presence as a society. Thank you.
Thanks, Luis, but I will point back to the point George made earlier, that if we have a non-com which is diverse enough to include members from different geographies, the chance that the geographic diversity of the resulting candidate pool will increase is quite high, and the result then is that the board selection increases the possibility that its diversity will be high. So it's definitely the case that we can encourage folks in different regions to participate as members of the NOMCOM, or to send candidates to the NOMCOM, and that will help ensure that the output of the process has a higher chance of diversity once the voting has occurred. I'll also point out that there's always a little bit of a question about geographic diversity of how you're counting it. For example, Charles is joining the board that is, I believe, currently in California, but I know his work primarily from his work in Hong Kong. And so there's a question of, do I count Charles from his current place, or from where the majority of his work has been, or from his natal place? Similarly for myself, I've worked primarily in California, originally from the US, but I live in Europe, specifically in Portugal now. How you count that diversity is another issue for ensuring you get geographic diversity. There's kind of no way of counting it that results in us not identifying at least some gaps in the current board. But it is important for us to understand what it is we're trying to achieve there. Luis, your hand is up. Do you still have a second intervention?
Sorry, didn't get tired of being up.
In chat, Ganella asks, non-com diversity seems to be a key part to improve diversity. Are there good ways to stimulate non-com diversity? Any folks wish to reflect on that, either from the board or from the floor? George?
Yes, I can comment on that. The committee is made up and must have at least one person recommended by chapters, by the chapters as a whole, and one person recommended by all of the organization members. Up after that, the choice of additional members is initially up to the chair, obviously to be approved by the board. And I purposely used that degree of freedom to select people who knew a lot about ISOC. There were 2 former ISOC board members on my committee, both female, and we went out of our way to get a diverse NOMCOM simply by selection. So in part, it's a function of what the chair does and what the board encourages the NOMCOM to try to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to follow up on that, I'm not aware of any occasion where, at least in recent memory, the board has rejected a recommendation by the NOMCOM chair for somebody to become a member of the NOMCOM. So it is definitely the case that the NOMCOM has quite a good bit of freedom there. Hans Petter in the chat notes that his experience from previous NOMCOMs was that there were many axes of diversity. As long as experience on other boards or ability to understand U.S. accounting rules or other special knowledge is used as filters, it's very hard to fulfill gender or geographic diversity. Hans-Peter, did you wish to comment further?
Just as a quick comment, the priority of rules, which is imposed either as written rules or verbally when the NOMCOM starts its work, influences in a great way or in a big way the ability to choose candidates from the rather small pools of candidates we have seen, at least in the years when I was working on one of the committees.
Cheryl?
Thanks, Cheryl, for the record. It just strikes me, and following on from Carlos, sorry, losing my voice, his recent intervention there, the rules base and the ordinance of the rules base when you're applying these sorts of filters is incredibly important, but they are far more easily applied to get greater effect, at least in my experience, when one has an appointing committee as opposed to a nominating committee that has a slate that then gets kind of almost, as a beauty contest voted on. You kind of lose a little bit of that influence in that particular model. Now, of course, some entities deal with that by making a bit of a hybrid, which is just one up of the other. So you have a degree of the board appointed in one mechanism and a balancing of the board appointed by a, often following in time, slightly different mechanism. But I'm not recommending that, I'm just making that as an observation. Thanks.
Thank you for that observation. I remind folks that if they would like to type their questions in French or Spanish into the chat, those will be translated. Or if they'd like to make an intervention in French or Spanish via one of the translators, please do use the facilities for that. Kevin, would you mind putting the slide for how to access the translation facilities back up for a moment? So I'll remind you that the floor is open. The board's here to listen, and if you have further comments on this topic, we're ready to hear them. Charles asks in the chat, given the current status with the GRWG, what might be possible next steps to consider? I think the current plan is for the board is to hold these meetings and then to discuss what the next steps are. So as the first of four, this will be input into that board discussion and into the next steps. And it looks like, George, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to make a comment on diversity, that discussion in this year's NOMCOM seemed to center more around the area of cultural diversity rather than geographic diversity, and that it was important to have various cultural frameworks from different regions with different customs available to make comments on the various candidates. That gets us away from geographic diversity and all of the issues that go with it that have been mentioned. For example, you would be considered U.S. no matter where you worked, and Charles would probably be considered Hong Kong as a space cultural space that he would represent. Thank you.
Thank you for that reflection. To go back to Charles's question, the point that we were discussing earlier about whether or not the board would use its power to appoint to increase the specific axis of diversity is one that I believe the board will continue to discuss and to work through what mechanisms it would use if it were to use that power. So advice from the community on whether they approve of the use of that power for this kind of diversity would definitely be welcome. And specifically, what process you would expect the board to use would be welcome. The other thing that the board might consider is taking some of the points that George made about the NOMCOM and working on ways to reinforce those either structurally or through communications, so that the diversity of the NOMCOM remained a mechanism for increasing the diversity of the candidate pool and thus eventually of the board. Richard, you have your hand up.
Well, thanks. The other potential action here that I think we touched on was this idea of leaning in someone's skill set diversity and having the board provide some feedback to the community about kind of what skills profile we think would be useful. That's something that we've done for a few years on the PIR side. I think it's been helpful there. I think it's something we could definitely consider as an action for this community, for the ISOC.
Thank you, Richard. Mohammed?
Yes, thanks, Ted. Mohammed Sudir for the record. 2 points. One is related to the exercise of the power, and that's the question that Ted posed to the community. My suggestion there would be that after the election process and the nomination process completes, there is like about 2 or 3 months time which is used for the preparation of the incoming trustees as well as the cycling process until the new board starts working. So if at all the board wanted to exercise its power of using the or appointing the new trustees, perhaps a committee or even non-com could consider the pool of candidates and the skill sets or the geographic or disability or any other diversity requirements that would be required at the board to fulfill and use this time, which was between the selection of the candidates by the communities and the actual start of the work of the candidates at the board. This can perhaps provide some time and the diversity if the board wanted to exercise its power, number one. Number two is that we also have to consider that how it's the internet society and the basic function of the Internet Society is to promote the Internet, to strengthen it, and to grow it. So we would, by defining diversity for the Internet Society, we would want to consider that how Internet impacts people in different groups, as well as how the people impact Internet. For instance, we always talk about the diversity and the disability of the diversity at different forums. Disability in terms of population, if we see, it is according to different estimates, 15% of world population, and it is transgender. It crosses gender. It can have in either gender. It is also trans-geographic, and also it's the cross-cultural issue. So when we are fulfilling this kind of, or defining diversity, we would want to consider that how Internet and people at the using Internet define diversity and impact it. This is my intervention. If anyone, any folks have any question or comment, I would be more welcome.
Thank you very much for your comments, Mohammed. On your first point, I noted that it sounded like you were recommending that the board make an appointment during the period between when the NOMCOM has, after the votes have been counted, and when the new members selected by the NOMCOM or the ITF are seated. I think that makes sense, but I'll point out that it means that the board that's doing the appointment is not the board that the new members will be part of. Because of the transition, that would mean that the board whose members are being replaced, in essence, or who are stepping down because of the term limits, would be the ones making the appointment, and that would be something I think we would want to discuss with the community to make sure that the community thought that was the appropriate board to make an appointment, or whether it should be the board after the new folks who are seated, who examine the question of diversity and come to their own conclusion about people like people might need to appoint. And that's one of the kind of transitional questions that I think is why use the board's power to appoint to address some of these issues hasn't been quite so simple as well, let's get some candidates in and do the right thing. Mohammed, your hand is up. Did you have a further intervention? So we have just a few minutes left. The floor is still open for a moment before we wrap up. Are there any final thoughts? Okay. Next, I'd like to, just as a form of wrap up, thank both of the chairs for the Governance Reform Working Group for their work, Hans Peter and George. We really appreciate the effort that you and that community put in to raising these issues to the board. Thank you very much. And we appreciate each of you who joined us here today for your thoughts and participation. There will be a second set of board comments later today, another round of comments on this topic. in order to make sure that different time zones have the opportunity to comment. And then there will be 2 more of these later this month to cover the other topic that was raised by the governance reform working group as a